call the good time part of town, but I think the most of the community would be religious-minded and conservative. My mother died when I was 8, for instance, and I was raised by this aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Wagner. They were good Presbyterians, and the Presbyterians in those days, most of them, and I guess Methodists too, you know, we never had a card in the house. We never had liquor in the house. I never heard my uncle swear all the time I was living with him. That's unusual, I'll admit. But still, these were pious people for the most part. They were interested in making money and having nice homes and you know, what you might call being somebody or achievement and having respect to the community. But there were a lot of people like that, farmers. The Baptists, when I was growing up here, there was no Catholic church. My father, who was a Catholic, his name Kelly, you might expect that, he came down here and to a community where there was no Catholic connection of any kind. He, because I suppose of the environment, that dropped away, became a Mason, so on. And in other words, it was a Protestant community. There was a good deal of prejudice against Catholics, I can remember that, and a good deal of prejudice against, of course, black people and Indians and so on. But the people who were running things were the middle-class business type of white that didn't associate any with black people except to trade with them.
Were there many
Indians the same way.
Yeah, were there many blacks in this area?
Yes, this area has always had a small minority of blacks. I think you might say they had 7% or so black people and 10% Indians. That would be my judgment.
Were there many flappers here in Watonga in the 20s?
Oh, I think so, yes. You call them, they might not have called themselves flappers, but they were sure flapping.
What would you consider a flapper?
Well, a flapper is a girl who wants to have a good time, first of all, I would think. I don't know what else you would say. They were more interested in having a good time than they were interested in making high marks in school, I would say.
And you weren't a flapper.
But I don't think that by any means the majority of girls were flappers. I think they were just as serious or more so than the boys, because they did better in school. They stayed with school longer. School in those days here didn't have much for farmer boys, really. Only for boys who might want to go to college or so on. In other words, they didn't have, like they do now, these agricultural specialties and so on. It really wasn't a very practical schooling for boys after you got into the high school. You studied Latin and you studied history and so on, but there's not much practical there. And boys tend to drop out. In my high school class, 1920, there were 8 boys and 20 girls, and that's about right. I think for them, they stayed with it. Maybe they were brighter than the boys, but I just think there was less interesting for people that were interested in farming and raising cattle and so on.
Did you go to college?
Yes, I went to college.
Where'd you go?
Yale.
Yale. What year did you go to Yale?
I went to Yale and I graduated in 1925. That would be about 1921.
What'd you study?
I studied literature, history, and law, things of that kind. I was interested in, newspaper work, events of the day, things like that interested me. I was the only man in my class of 1,000 from Oklahoma. I think that's one reason they let me in there, because they wanted to, scatter their geography a little bit. Most of the boys there were graduates of Eastern finishing schools or prep schools, whatever you want to call them. And they largely looked upon me as a kind of hick, you know, which I was, no doubt of that.
Mhm.
But it was not my class of people, really. I didn't really belong there.
Why did you go to Yale?
Well, those things are oftentimes coincidence. I met a doctor out in Los Angeles who was a Yale graduate, and he thought, you know, that there was no other college, that you weren't really going to college if you didn't go to Yale. So he got me interested, and I went down to the Yale Club in Los Angeles, and you know how it is. They can, if the right people write, the right people, they can sometimes get you into Yale, although you have no business being there. And that's how it happened to me.
Mm-hmm. Did you stay on campus or off campus?
Everybody lived on campus, not practically everybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
You live in the dorm?
That's
Dormitory? Okay. What was dorm life like at Yale in the 20s?
Well, I found it pretty hard at Yale because I wasn't really prepared to go into Yale, and they had a higher standard of scholarship than I was used to, so I had to study pretty hard. But life in the dorms varied pretty much as it would, I think, most places. There would be the serious type of student, and then there would be the playboy type of student. They didn't mix much. You know, you had people there at Yale, most of them were just rich men's sons who were there to graduate from Yale and to enjoy the privileges of associating with those upper class of people, you might call them, or wealthy people, and perhaps crash in themselves if they weren't already in that group.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing democratic about it.
Mm-hmm. What do you do for recreation at Yale?
Well, I was pretty serious at Yale. I spent a lot of time in the gymnasium. I said I was kind of fragile growing up here in Watauga, and they got me interested in working out in the gymnasium. And I spent quite a bit of time there, and I worked pretty hard there. I couldn't have stayed in there if I had played around.
Mm-hmm. Where'd you work?
In your own rooms. You had suites of rooms. You'd have maybe 2 or 3 bedrooms with 2 or 3 students having a common living room.
Okay. Did you have a job while you were at Yale?
No.
No. Okay. What was the price of tuition at that time?
At that time, it was only $600 a year. I think it's near 10,000 now. If not more, maybe 15,000. I really haven't inquired recently. But it's very, very expensive, as you know, to go to school most anywhere.
Yeah. Right. After your commencement exercise was 1925 at Yale?
I graduated in 1925, yes.
Who gave the commencement speech?
Pardon me?
Who gave the commencement speech?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it?
Okay, what did you do after college?
Well, I ran the newspaper here in Watauga part of the time, and I also had an idea that metropolitan or cosmopolitan journalism was very glamorous, and I got a job on the Chicago Tribune and went to Paris and worked there for a while, in France. I had a friend here who was running the Watauga Herald. We were running it together. A fellow named Martin Cunningham, who later became a congressional secretary. We got busy and supported a candidate for Congress here in the district, and he got elected, and he took Mr. Cunningham with him to Congress when he got elected. His name was Jed Johnson, and he was there for, I believe, 20 years or more. Jed Johnson is a congressman from this district, and he was congressman because we helped elect him. Cunningham knew Johnson before that. He lived with him lived in the same area in Cotton County. So when Jed started running for Congress, Martin Cunningham started writing these editorials in our paper. What a wonderful guy this fellow Jed Johnson was, and most people in the district didn't know it was just a couple of boys up here running the newspaper. And so Jed Johnson picked up these editorials and he published them in all the other newspapers, you know, and people really got to believing he was a remarkable person. And so he went to Congress. He succeeded Elmer Thomas as congressman.
Okay.
And he stayed there for 20 years. And Cunningham worked with him as administrative secretary.
Mm-hmm. Ever hear of Manuel Herrick?
Yes.
Do you know who he was?
It seems to me that Herrick was a congressman himself, wasn't he?
Do you know anything about him?
Wasn't he a Republican?
I'm not sure, but he couldn't read or write.
Nick Gensman was a congressman here, a Republican congressman. While I was at Yale, I remember, you see, in 1920 there was the big upset, and the Democratic congressman was beaten. You know, Scott Ferris was congressman in this area for many years. He was beaten, and the Republican who were just running just for the exercise, named Nick Gensman down here in Lawton, was elected over the Democrat. They never had a Republican in Congress from this area before. So when I was up at Yale, I went down to see Nick Gensman at Washington and visited him. Of course, he's always glad to see me because I own this newspaper out here. And so I got acquainted with him too. So I knew both the Republicans and the Democrats in those days here.
Okay. 1930s. How did the Depression affect the newspaper?
Well, it didn't affect this particular newspaper because we sold it in 1928.
Okay, you sold it.
Yeah.
Why did you sell it?
I was really bothered with the asthma here at the point where I really had to move.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't need to sell it financially because I had other properties too. So I really had to leave because of my health.
Mm-hmm.
That really terminated my newspaper career here.
When did you go to Paris?
Well, in 1925, late in 25.
Mm-hmm. What did you do in Paris?
I was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune edition of there. There were two, at those times, there were two English-speaking editions, two English-speaking newspapers, English newspapers. One was the New York Herald Tribune and Old New York Herald at that time, and the other was Chicago Tribune. Mr. McCormick, had a lot of money, both from the farm machinery business and the Chicago Tribune business.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to swing a lot in Europe, and of course we were very much interested in Europe after the First World War. He was a military hero, or at least wanted to be. Mm-hmm. So he invested in this daily newspaper as a part of the glamour, I guess, for the Chicago Tribune itself, which was making a whole lot of money, probably more than any other newspaper in the country in those days. So they ran the two English newspapers then in Paris. There was a large English-speaking population, a lot of Americans living in Europe after the First World War, too.
How'd you like Paris?
Well, I thought as a young man at that time that it was a very interesting, exciting place to live. People are very impressionable at that age. All I had to do mostly was go around from one big hotel to another, interviewing prominent Americans who came over there, and hoped to get favorable publicity of some kind or other. And so it was an easy kind of life for me at the time, and perhaps a good way to enter that kind of journalism, metropolitan journalism, whatever you might call it.
How long did you stay in Paris?
I was only there until 1926. I came back because I had this Watauga Herald going all the time. I had to come back and see what was happening here.
Mm-hmm. What did you do in the 1930s after you sold the newspaper?
Well, I have worked in newspapers from time to time in Los Angeles and in New York, and I've lived in Florida and so on. I would not put myself up as someone who depended upon the newspaper business for a living, because I did not. I just had enough properties that I didn't have to actually work for a living. I can't pretend that I did.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about the Depression, 1930s. How did that affect you?
Well, the 1930s was, I think, hard on all, very hard on all young people at that time. It, of course, created disillusionment. To find, let's say a quarter of the whole working force of the country was out of work, and they were selling apples, let us say. There was no unemployment insurance. People, were out on the street, and the middle class too suffered greatly. People who had made a competence in life, many of them lost it within overnight, let us say, or months, and they were shifted from a middle class position to a position where they might have to move in with somebody in the family or something of that kind. You cannot appreciate the depth and the disaster of the Depression unless you were a person that had to make a living at that time and had no jobs. The government, as you know, had no provision for anybody. It was a very desperate time, and of course it had a very profound effect on people who did any thinking about things. There was a great shift toward radicalism. People just couldn't believe that things could go from something to nothing. I suppose it's an experience that you have to appreciate really the desperateness of people and the way it would shake them and their attitudes toward the government, toward life in general, toward each other. A lot of bitterness, in family life and so on. When you throw people together who haven't been together and expose them to all kinds of hardship. Mm-hmm. Here in this area, people would be getting 25 and 30 cents a bushel for wheat, and you were just out. Of course, they'd had a very bad economic depression here after the First World War, and in the early 20s. There was no more $3 wheat, for instance, and prices went down to the point where people were hard up. That was all.
Did you lose any of your properties in the Depression?
No, I can't say that I did, because I didn't have anything heavily encumbered or anything of that kind. But in other words, I will have to admit that I was something of an innocent bystander. But at the same time, you cannot help but be deeply affected by the injustice of the situation that arises, where so many of the people are utterly declassed, so to speak, and millions hungry.
Did you live in Watauga in those years, in the 30s?
No, I was in and out of Watauga, but I really didn't live in Watauga. I was in and out, visiting my relatives here, and looking after what few properties I had around.
Ever go through any dust storms here?
Well, yesterday and the day before. Yes, I have. You can't live here, as you probably know, without going through dust storms that last as much as a week at least.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one of the more disagreeable facts about life in Oklahoma. I don't think you're getting away from that. But it all in all has an equitable climate, and really the country is so fertile, and that was one of my problems, that there was so much pollen around that gave me the asthma that I couldn't stay here.
World War II. Did you do any work for the war effort in the Second World War?
No, I can't say that I did, except I was working as a newspaper person. I was too old for the Second World. No, don't say I'd be too old for the second and too young for the first.
Yeah.
So I was never. I don't know I could ever pass the test for that matter, getting in the Army or the Navy. I never had to. But I was just one of those, let's not say fortunate people, who was in that age bracket, so that I didn't have to serve in the war.
You say that you worked as a newspaper person in
That's
the war?
right, in New York. I was working.
In New York. Did you cover the victory parades?
Did I participate in the victory parade?
Did you cover the victory parades when the soldiers came back?
Oh, I covered a little bit of everything, but not precisely, let
Okay.
us say, that sort
Okay.
of thing. That's right.
When did you return to Wetumpka to stay?
I came back to Wetumpka a year ago, February,
Mm-hmm.
and I bought a home, the first home that we've had in all our married lives here in Wetumpka. That is really own a home. You know, if you live in cities, you don't live in private homes normally. You live in apartment houses instead. So.
And did you live in New York City before you came back here?
That's right.
Okay.
I lived in New York City mostly from about 1939 on. Until
Is your turn now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you through with me now?
No,
No,
just
the Ford automobile in 1909, Lee Huckins Hotel was the headquarters.
Lee Huckins Hotel. Is
Yeah,
that where you
that's made in
stayed?
Broadway in those days, you know.
Is that where you stayed, the Huckins Hotel?
Yeah, well, when we went down there, we always stayed at Huckins Hotel. You'd go down there on the train in the evening. We had a train on the Rock Island, went down in the evening and came back in the morning. You had to get up at 5 o'clock to go over to the Rock Island station from the Huckins, walk 2 or 3 blocks to get to the Rock Island station, take the train up to Wetumpka, which got here after stops at El Reno and Garrett for quite a while. They got here about 9 o'clock in the morning. And that's the train accommodations that we had here. And then we had the Rock Island line on the east side of town, which went between Enid and Waurika. And the trains usually met here about noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Nobody's home. I got a key to the door and I can't get the key out.
Oh, where was it?
Across the road.
In the very early days here, that was the Choctaw Northern on that route. That ran between Oklahoma City and Alva. And then the Rock Island took it over.
Over and tried again.
So they continued to run the trains. But actually, the Rock
Excuse me.
Island, I think they were lasted here until the 1930s, didn't they? The railroad lasted here and they had regular rail service.
Good. See, they moved the capital to Oklahoma City in 1910, I believe. Did you have any thoughts on moving the capital?
No, I was of course very young in 1910. I would be, 8 years of age. But of course I heard about those things, heard people talk about them. Oklahoma politics, as far as I was concerned, was rather commonplace thing to talk about, because my father was so involved in them. He ran this Wetumpka Herald from 1906 on to the time of his death in 1919, and he was very active in politics. He was a delegate to the national conventions and so forth in 1908 and 12 and 16. He ran, I remember for Corporation Commissioner, 1918. I think he came in second in the nomination. But he was an active person and made, I suppose you could say, his living partially from politics. He was an organizer for the Democratic Party and knew all of the people down there. I used to go to the Capitol with him. As a kid, he'd take me along, you know, now and then. But,
When you sold the newspaper, who'd you sell it to?
told to Harrison Brown, postmaster here. He had also ran newspapers here before, and he was a Republican wheel horse. Had been a state senator, and was at one time an editor, manager of the Republican while Ferguson was governor. They hired Harrison Brown to manage the thing, and he and Mrs. Ferguson had a falling out, I think, because Harrison Brown was postmaster in those days. Later, when I was running the newspaper, Harrison Brown was postmaster, and I think Mrs. Ferguson refused to support him for a new term as postmaster, and that was the reason he came over to me and wanted to buy the newspaper, because he wanted to kick Mrs. Ferguson around a little, you know, because she had probably been kicking him around. I don't know. You know how politics can become quite a personal thing. You're a friend and buddy one day, and the next month it may be quite different.
Right. How long did the Herald last before?
I think the Herald was sold about 1934. That would be my remembrance. But
Then did it join with the Republican?
and then the Republican Herald joined. Yes, that's right. And there's only been the Republican here since then. I don't believe anyone has ever successfully started and run a newspaper here since that time.
Man, do you have any questions?
Don't really, dear.
Anything that we haven't covered?
No, I think you've done a pretty thorough job here, and I
Thank you.
appreciate getting to meet you and talk about it. I'll come down to perhaps sometime and ask you some questions about Oklahoma history.
Sure, come on, I'll tell you what I can.
I'm sure that you know a lot more about it than I do, because I've been out of state so much.
Well, I've learned a lot with this job, traveling the state, talking to the people. I've learned a lot. Thank you.
Yes.